Howdy everyone, and today I'm testing out a lens that I've had a lot of requests to review, the Sony 200-600mm f5.6 to 6.3 G OSS. It is only for Sony's E-mount mirrorless cameras, full frame or APS-C, and it costs $2,000 or £1,600 here in the UK. So it's definitely not cheap, especially considering you can get decent quality third-party 150-600mm lenses for much less money, but for an official Sony lens of this size and focal length, it's a reasonable price, and it also seems to have garnered some very good reviews out there on the information superhighway, so I couldn't wait to test it out. I'd like to thank my friend Simon for loaning me this little monster from his lens collection for a couple of weeks for testing. Thank you, brother. Sony are currently the only company who won't loan me lenses for review, so that's why I'm a little behind on their latest releases. A zoom range of 200-600mm is of course a long telephoto reach the whole way, and the slightly dark maximum aperture of f5.6 to 6.3 means that this lens can be relatively portable, so it's extremely useful for wildlife photography or for taking on safari. It's particularly useful to zoom out to 200mm to look around for your subject, and then zoom into it when one shows up. It could also be used for sports photography too, but only on a day when there's plenty of light for you, because of that narrow maximum aperture not really letting in much light or giving you very out of focus backgrounds. 600mm is particularly useful for bird photography too. This particular lens sports excellent build quality. The lens's barrel is solid and metallic, long and thin, and while its weight of just over 2 kilograms or nearly 5 pounds is considerable, it's still relatively easy to hand hold and carry the lens around with you. It's based on a metal lens mount with weather sealing, and there's room in there to use Sony's 1.4x and 2x teleconverters too, which are sold separately. The lens has its own image stabilization system, which is particularly important as your camera's internal stabilization won't be very effective at long focal lengths. Here is some footage with stabilization turned off and now turned on. And as you can see, it helps quite a lot, although at 600mm your footage certainly won't be stable enough for handheld video work, if that's what you were hoping for. The lens features a lot of controls on the side for focus and image stabilization, so that, thankfully, you don't have to keep digging through the camera's menu system to change anything. It also comes with an adjustable and removable tripod mount, although I did find it to be slightly wobbly. Then comes a rubberized focus ring. It turns extremely smoothly and it adjusts your focus very responsively. As you can see here, the lens does not really suffer from focus breathing. Your field of view will stay the same whether you're zoomed in or zoomed out. The lens's autofocus motor is nice and quick and pretty accurate in use. I had no problems with this lens's autofocus system at all on my A7R III camera. Next comes the lens's zoom ring, which turns very smoothly without any stickiness to it. Something nice to see is this lens's internal zoom mechanism. 150-600mm lenses from third parties extend and contract as you zoom in and out, making them more likely to collect dust within their optics. The lens's filter thread size is 95mm wide, so filters will obviously cost a little money, and it comes with a fairly deep lens hood. Overall, we are dealing with awesome build quality here. The only slight niggles that I could find were the slightly wobbly tripod mount, and also I wish the image stabilization were just a little more steady. I found it to be a little better in Canon's 600mm and 800mm f11 lenses. But let's move on and look at image quality now. We will start with a full frame camera, my 42MP Sony A7R III. In-camera corrections are turned on for these tests. At 200mm and f5.6, we see just good sharpness in the middle of the image. Contrast is a little low due to some slight ghosting. The corner image quality is just slightly softer, but still sharp enough for most users. Stop down to f8 and the corners are a bit punchier, and back in the middle we now see excellent image quality emerging. F11 looks the same across the image frame, and F16 begins to soften just a little bit from the effect of diffraction. Let's zoom into 400mm now. The maximum aperture has darkened down to f6.3 at this point. The middle of the image looks very good here with good contrast, although sharpness is still shying away from perfection. The good news though is that the corners look just as good. They almost look sharper than the middle, in fact. Stop down to f8 and those corners become almost perfect, and the middle of the image looks absolutely brilliant too. So again, the lens is very sharp at the brightest aperture and excellent when stopped down just a little. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 600mm. It's more or less the same story here. The middle of the image is very sharp, although not perfectly so, and contrast is just good. The corner image quality is just a little softer, but still quite satisfactory for a 42 megapixel camera. Stop down to f8 and those corners look a little punchier, and back in the middle the image is excellent now, very sharp with very good contrast. Stop down to f11 and image quality remains the same. So this lens is clearly a very consistent performer, always nice and sharp at its brightest aperture and brilliantly sharp when stopped down just a little. You really can't ask for much more than that from a lens of this kind, although I should warn you that this 42 megapixel camera sensor is brushing up against the lens's limits. I don't think you'll get any more detail than this from a higher resolution camera. Alright, let's quickly test it on an APS-C camera too, my little Sony A5100 with its 24 megapixel APS-C sized sensor. We'll start at 200mm. Do you remember that 200mm was a bit weaker on the full frame camera? Well, the more demanding APS-C sensor exposes that weakness a little more, and your image looks a bit soft at f5.6 in the middle, but it's no worse in the corners though, thankfully. Stop down to f8 for a nice improvement in those corners, which now look reasonably sharp, and the middle of the image looks very good now. Here's f11, where you can see just a slight softening from the effects of diffraction, which kick in a little early on the smaller camera sensor. Let's go to the other extreme and look at 600mm. At f6.3, the image quality on APS-C actually holds out fairly well, thankfully, looking sharper than at the widest angle. Corner image quality is very good too, so that's actually really impressive. Normally, super telephoto lenses do not perform well at all on APS-C cameras. Stop down to f8 and those corners brighten up a little, and picture quality back in the middle is very slightly sharper again. Stop down to f11 and everything still looks fairly decent. So overall, on an APS-C camera, you're getting some very impressive results here as you zoom in. This is a great show, actually. Just remember, when shooting at wider angles, you will want to stop down the aperture a bit, just for best results. Alright, let's turn off in-camera corrections and take a look at distortion and vignetting. At 200mm, the lens projects a noticeable pincushion distortion, although vignetting is quite low here. Stop down to f8 and those corners get brighter. As you zoom all the way into 600mm, that pincushion distortion remains, although vignetting does get more noticeable at f6.3. Again, stop down to f8 and those corners brighten up. This lens's minimum focus distance is 2.4 meters. That sounds pretty far away, but when shooting at 600mm, you're still able to get very close to your subject here. At f6.3, close-up sharpness remains quite good, but contrast is still a little low. Stop down to f8 and that close-up image quality becomes noticeably sharper. Let's see how well the lens works against bright lights now. At wide angles, there are very few issues, little in the way of flaring or glaring or loss of contrast. Zoom in and bright lights still will only cause an issue when directly in your image or right on the edge, so generally the lens is grasping hold of its contrast very well. And finally, bokeh. This lens might have only quite a dark maximum aperture, but when working at such extreme telephoto ranges, it's still quite easy to get out of focus backgrounds, and there are really no problems here with those at all. Those backgrounds look lovely and soft, even the more difficult ones. Overall, the Sony FE 200-600mm lens is one that any wildlife photographer would be delighted to have in their arsenal. It's sharp, with high build quality and good weather sealing. It produces consistently excellent images, although you'll still want to shoot at quite high ISO levels with it. And what's more, it's relatively portable. It's a bit sharper and classier overall than its 150 to 600mm competitors from Tamron and Sigma, although it does cost more too, but the hype behind it seems pretty justified as it is a delightful lens, so it comes highly recommended. Hey, so what you doing? Are you going to move on and watch another YouTube video now? Before you do, check out my Patreon page, the link is in the description below. You can support the channel over there to help me keep these reviews coming, and there's a bunch of exclusive content for supporters over there too, including special exclusive monthly videos. Ciao for now, everybody.